Well, it's the Quick Open today. This is Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd reporting from Washington, and we're at the Quick Open because we got breaking news out of the Supreme Court. Just moments ago, the court temporarily blocked that Texas federal court district court's ruling that would have pulled a common abortion drug, Mifepristone, off the shelves across the United States at midnight tonight. This key abortion drug is part of a two-step regimen that accounts for half of all abortions that take place in the United States these days. The court ruled in favor of the Justice Department temporarily after the DOJ requested that the court intervene and supersede a partial stay that was issued by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. That stay would have kept the pill legal, but significantly increased regulations to obtain and use it. This ruling means that neither stay or the original Texas ruling will go into effect overnight, but it still could go into effect at a later point. All of this essentially basically just stops the clock this weekend. So I got a slew of experts with me right now to help break this down. NBC News Washington correspondent Yamiche Alcindor covers the abortion rights fight in this country for us. Also with me, I got Robert Barnes, the Supreme Court correspondent for the Washington Post, and we will have Laura Jarrett, our senior legal correspondent, joining us in a moment. But Yamiche, break down, give me the quick details of this stay from Justice Alito.
Well, it's certainly an important development here, and I want to make sure I'm reading part of this because I think it's important. Justice Alito is granting the Justice Department's request for an administrative stay to preserve the status quo when it comes to this abortion pill. He called for a response from the plaintiffs that originally filed the Texas lawsuit, and this means that last week's decision, as you said, will not go into effect tonight, but this is only stayed until 11:59 p.m. on Wednesday, April 19th, 2023. So this means that for now, if you want access to this pill, from my understanding and from reading this, nothing is changing as of yet. But this shows that the Supreme Court is going to be looking at this and that both sides will be able, it seems, to plead their case in front of the Supreme Court. We have to remind folks that this is possibly going to be the most important abortion decision or abortion looking at an issue with abortion when it comes to this issue after Roe v. Wade, because we saw, of course, that huge decision, that sea change when Roe v. Wade was overturned. And now this is really the next big front in talking to people about abortion and talking to people about abortion access in this country. Well,
let me bring in Robert Barnes here, who's on Deadline and is gracefully taking a quick break to give us your perspective. Robert, nobody understands how this court works as well as you do, maybe a couple other people on Earth. So tell me how should we read into this ruling? Alito, essentially, it's a 1-week stay. What does that mean? Or 5-day stay. What does that mean?
Yeah, I don't think you should read anything about the merits of the case or what the court might ultimately do. The court was faced with a very short time frame here, had to make a decision by midnight. So this gives them the chance to get a little more briefing, to sort of take a breath. It keeps the status quo in place until next week, as you have explained. And so then the court will face some other options about what to do.
So what are those other, what's the most likely way this plays out next week? They'll schedule a full hearing for down the road. Is there going to be a full hearing Monday or Tuesday? Walk me through the scenarios.
No, there wouldn't be a full hearing then. What would happen, the government has said, if you want to take this up right now, schedule full briefing and a hearing and a decision before you recess this summer. But the court doesn't have to do that. The court either could put this ruling from the lower courts on hold and hear the case next term, or the court could decide to let these lower court decisions go into effect. All of this is in place of the regular process, not in place of, but to sort of allow the regular process of the appeals courts going first and really looking in depth at the merits of this case.
Do you read anything into the idea that Justice Alito wants to hear from the original plaintiff?
No, that's a standard procedure. And I should also say that the reason Justice Alito is doing this is not because he wrote the Dobbs decision, although he did, but because he is the justice designated by the court to receive emergency orders from the Fifth Circuit.
So if they want to hear briefs, so basically, does this mean they get briefs, they have to be filed, I believe it's by the 18th, so they're just going to make a... What happens the next day? They read these briefs and they make a decision about whether to keep going or not?
Yes, and whether or not to extend this stay that they have now put in place, or whether to get rid of it. That would be the first thing that they have to decide. And then they would have to decide whether or not they want to hear this case on an emergency basis. As I say, the court usually likes appeals courts to go first and to try to, work through all the issues that a case like this involves. But they don't always do it. And the other thing that sort of pushed them here was they have a different judge in the state of Washington saying this drug has to remain available in 17 states in the District of Columbia that came to me with their request. And so it's a very complicated situation that the court's trying to work through.
And just quickly, Robert, and then I know you got to go on deadline. Do we assume that that there were just that there were at least 5 votes, or is this an Alito only temporary decision before, or is this a case where there had to be 5 votes for this temporary stay?
No, I think that there surely were. I'm sure that this is what the rest of the courts would like to do. But Justice Alito did this on his own. And that is often the case when, as I say, a justice from one of these appeals courts is faced with making a very quick decision and issues an administrative stay.
All right, Robert Barnes, I promised that I would get you in and out. Again, I know you've got your own news organization, your own bosses to report to in this breaking news, so much appreciate you. Yamiche.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to bring Laura Jarrett in here, but Yamiche, I want to get you to respond. Where do we expect the Justice Department, what do they hope to have here? Do they want just this whole thing to go away? Or are they essentially preparing for a hearing in the Fifth Circuit?
Well, from my understanding, at least from what we hear from the Justice Department, they are saying that this ruling, if it is allowed to stand, and if the FDA is allowed to be, if an FDA approval is allowed to be taken away by a court, that won't just have impact on this abortion pill. It will have impact on all sorts of other medications, whether that's Alzheimer's, whether that's cancer, whether that's all sorts of other things that the FDA approves. So my understanding is that the Justice Department wants to say we should continue to leave scientific approval in the hands of the FDA, and that they want to be able to say that this should not be something that is taken away by a court. The approval should be able to stand. And when I talk to people who are close to this, and I talk to people who are watching this case, of course, they're also focused specifically, of course, on the abortion piece here, because as you said, something like 50% of the women who are having abortions in this country use medication abortion. And this is seen as very, very scary that this could be taken away from them. This is in some ways the right continuing to go forward and trying to find restrictions and ways to lessen access to abortion after having that big generational win in Roe v. Wade. I remember at the time talking to conservative activists saying that they were going to continue to go forward, that this was not sort of winning Roe v. Wade was not going to be the only thing that they were going to go after. So when you look at the Justice Department, they're asking for something specific, but also when you're looking at people who are worried about access for abortion, they're hoping that all of this goes away and that women are able to have more access.
We'll bring in our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett. Laura, what role do you believe the Washington state ruling, which was in direct conflict with the Texas ruling, played in Justice Alito's decision?
A lot, because it sets up a direct conflict, and a direct conflict is typically one that the Supreme Court wants to resolve in the lower courts to give them guidance so that you don't have sort of this patchwork of bizarre rulings where literally the FDA could be held in contempt of court for not following that Washington ruling. We talk about it, being co-equal, certainly those 2 district courts, but if they don't follow that Washington one, it could be quite serious, especially since the judge doubled down on it yesterday, reiterating you have to follow this order, FDA. So it is certainly possible that Alito found that to be one of the reasons why it would be prudent to at least put on the administrative stay. Now, we should be clear. Just because he's done this administrative stay doesn't mean that when it comes to the merits of this issue, he's going to rule in favor of the Biden administration. We've seen this before where he puts on an administrative stay and then it comes out a different way when it comes to the merits. But what this really does, especially since it's only him doing this, is it just preserves the status quo to get everyone out from underneath this midnight deadline, which by all accounts was sort of this arbitrary deadline that the judge had set for no reason for a drug that had been on the market for 23 years, mind you. And so I think the idea was, let's just hear everybody out. We haven't even heard from the plaintiffs.
Yeah.
And so the justice is ordering, obviously, the plaintiffs to respond to this because they haven't so far. We've only heard from the Justice Department and the pill manufacturer.
But, Laura, what is 5 days by?
What is 5 days by?
Yeah.
Oh, well, the Supreme Court, I think, has enough clerks and enough smart folks in that building to figure out what they want to do with this. But at least it doesn't. The whole idea is if they had asked for just a pure stay, the worry was they wouldn't be able to get themselves together enough by just like 6 hours from now, right? Or I guess more than that to be able to put it in. And so that's why you asked for the administrative stay. It's just because of the time crunch. The longer stay issue, again, it's not clear how they'll come out, but I think you might see a decision by Wednesday. Or at least Thursday.
Let me ask you this. What are I guess the various scenarios are they could throw it back to the Fifth Circuit and tell them to do a full hearing.
Which it's already agreed to do. The Fifth Circuit has agreed to expedite this.
Right.
So if, in fact, they say, OK, we're going to keep the stay on the district court order in Texas. So Kazmierik's stuff essentially stays on hold. So then procedurally what happens is the case goes back down to the Fifth Circuit. They will hear it on an expedited basis in May. The Fifth Circuit tends to lean conservative. If it rules against the Justice Department, then that will go back up to the Supreme Court for a full appeal. But at least the stay preserves the status quo while the case is, circles around the courts.
And Laura, is that your assumption? Is that the most likely scenario, that this is going to get stayed until there's a full hearing, and there's a full hearing at the Supreme Court? So this could get. Bob Barnes was essentially kind of predicting that it could be the next term, in the fall, that the Supreme Court says we're going to hear this and we're going to stay this till, say, the end of the year.
I'm not so sure. If you had asked me that 2 years ago, I might have a different answer. I think after the court struck down Roe, I'm not so sure that's what they'll do here, especially because remember what we're talking about is not the invalidation of the original approval of Mifepristone. That's no longer on the table. Even the Fifth Circuit said that wasn't okay. All we're talking about now is a number of steps that the FDA takes starting in 2016 that makes it easier to get the drug. And so the justices may say, hey, in the year 2000, people weren't being harmed. And for 16 years, you had this drug and nobody said that there was irreparable harm. So how can you say that there's irreparable harm now just because you can't get it in the mail?
Right.
They may not find that burdensome enough. And that's why I'm not so sure that they will stay this piece of the order.
Yamiche, there's been some chatter that one idea circulating in the Biden world is resubmitting Mifepristone for a new authorization. Is that on the table or not?
It's a good question. I'm not sure if it's on the table. It's obviously something that could be on the table if you have an administration that's just trying to find new ways to give women access to abortion, because this, of course, is an administration that realizes that they are dealing with a Supreme Court that already overturned precedent, that has already shown that it is, in their minds, willing to, they would say, revoke a right that women had lived with for years and years and years. So I think it's not, while I don't know exactly whether or not they're going to do that, I think it is not surprising that could be something that happens, because this is an administration that has said that they're going to try to do everything they can other than break the law to get women access to abortion.
All right, let's move from our constitutional law scholarship here and move to medical school, if you will. I'm going to bring in Kristen Lyerly. She's an OBGYN. Currently practicing in Minnesota due to Wisconsin's current strict abortion law that we expect to be off the books soon. So, Dr. Lyerly, let's talk about the fallout on the medical side of things. So, if the new version of this ruling is put into place, where you're down to just 7 weeks where you can use this and you can't do it in the mail, give me some practical impacts medically for women.
Well, I think the most important thing that needs to be mentioned is Mifepristone is safe, Mifepristone is effective, and Mifepristone has been used for over 20 years. Over 5 million people in this country have used this medication. Doctors know how to use Mifepristone. We know that it works up until 10 weeks, and we use it for abortions, of course, but we also use it for miscarriage management. This is a very commonly used medication. it is our imperative to be able to offer our patients the safest, most effective medications. And taking away this option up through the 10th week of pregnancy is just, it's truly unimaginable for those of us who use it.
So if you have a miscarriage and it's past 10 weeks and you don't have Mifepristone, what do you do?
Well, if it's before 10 weeks, that's generally when we're using Mifepristone, then we do have the option of just using one medication, but it's not nearly as effective as the dual regimen. So if we're only using the Mifepristone, patients are more likely to have to come back for a second dose of medication, for a surgical procedure, for things that cost more money, that mean they have to take more time away from work. They need more help with taking care of their kids and their other daily obligations. It is just a much less effective way of delivering care.
Let's talk about a pregnancy that's at 6 weeks or 7 weeks. How often do people know they're pregnant at 6 weeks or 7 weeks?
Some people do.
Right.
But a lot of people don't. And that's where things get really tricky across the country, especially with these really early bans like what we're seeing down in Florida. It just makes it really hard for us to offer care, for people to seek care. You know, one of the biggest problems that we're seeing is doctors don't know what kind of care they can deliver. Patients don't know what kind of care they can receive because of all of the confusion and all of these changes that are happening. This, again, is such a huge disservice to people who are seeking women's health care in general.
Explain why you won't, right now, you won't practice in Wisconsin. Why?
Wisconsin has an abortion ban that dates back to 1849, which is a year after Wisconsin was formed as a state. This ban has only one exception, and it's for the life of the mother, but that is ill-defined. So I am very open, I'm very outspoken, and I don't feel that it's safe for me to practice general OBGYN care. Abortion doesn't live on a satellite somewhere. You know, like abortion is actually part of contraception care, miscarriage management, helping people with complicated pregnancies. So abortion care is too deeply integrated into women's health care for us to tease out and feel comfortable practicing in a state that is so hostile when it comes to abortion care.
Look, I don't, and how many other of your OBGYN colleagues are you seeing leave communities where there is questions about the legality of the law? Because that would mean there's a lot of people who suddenly are not going to even have. I mean, I know this is something that some lawmakers have brought up, even on the right side of the aisle, going, hey, will there be any OBGYNs available in rural red America?
Well, and they should be questioning that. We're seeing this in Idaho right now. There already weren't enough doctors in Idaho to take care of the population there, and doctors are fleeing. Wisconsin's a little bit of a different story because we have hope now. So many of my colleagues do have other plans just in case things don't work out, but we are dearly hoping that we can keep practicing in Wisconsin, and I can't wait to get back because I'm a sixth-generation Wisconsinite. I want to take care of my people.
Let me ask you this on Mifepristone. What is the most common side effect that you would have before 10 weeks?
If taking Mifepristone, there really aren't any significant side effects. It is so fundamentally safe, Chuck. It is safer than Viagra. It is safer than ibuprofen and Tylenol that you get over the counter. My patients have not had any adverse effects from Mifepristone. They are exceedingly rare.
All right, I just wanted to get that in there as well. Laura Jarrett, Yamichelle Sindor, Dr. Lyerly, thank you all for helping us, getting us started with this breaking news, both from the legal front and the medical front. Up ahead, we're going to talk about the political front. Republicans have been grappling with some unpopular politics when it comes to the abortion bans around the country, especially after Florida's governor signs into law one of the country's most restrictive. Plus, inside the manhunt, arrest, and first court appearance of one of the biggest leakers of U.S. intelligence in a decade. I'll talk to the Washington Post reporter who first broke the story wide open before the FBI went public with what it knew. You're watching Meet the Press Now. And now to the politics. Today's ruling comes a day after Florida Governor DeSantis, late last night, quietly signed into law one of the nation's strictest abortion bans. That bill mostly bans most abortions in Florida after 6 weeks, before many women even know they're pregnant. It's the latest example of a candidate trying to pitch themselves to the Trump base. The Florida legislation would also impose significant hurdles to qualify for an exception in cases of rape, incest, or human trafficking. A position like that is not popular nationally among voters. And when Florida voters were asked their opinion about a similarly hardline policy, a 6-week ban with no exceptions, Republicans also didn't like it at all in Florida, 2-1. Compounding issues for DeSantis is that his emerging campaign operation seems to have struggled as he simultaneously tries to pick off Trump voters while making himself seem like a more reasonable alternative to Trump. He had the unfortunate optics of rushing back to Florida last night from Battleground, Ohio, not to attend to the devastating floods in the southern part of his state, but to quickly sign the 6-week ban legislation behind closed doors, no media. He then promptly left the state of Florida again this morning to play up some conservative bona fides as governor at Virginia's Liberty University, where he spoke today. But then he didn't mention the 6-week ban, though it was a major part of his introduction. Take a listen.
We have embraced freedom. We have maintained law and order. We have protected the rights of parents. We have elevated the importance of family and promoted a culture of life. We have respected our taxpayers, and we have rejected woke ideology.
In addition, DeSantis has stumbled when he attempted to carve out an even Trumpier position on the war in Ukraine, initially dismissing it as a territorial dispute to Tucker Carlson. And then, after getting criticized by the establishment and donors, he quickly changed his tune and called Putin a war criminal. And in a quest to bolster his culture war credentials, he picked that fight with Disney, seemed to have won, found out he got outmaneuvered, and then kind of threw a temper tantrum about it. To be fair, other potential Republican presidential candidates aren't faring a whole lot better at the moment. We've seen numerous Republican candidates struggle to answer simple questions about how they'd be different than Trump, while also struggling with the hardline positions taken by so many in his base. My NBC News colleague today, Ali Vitale, sat down with Republican Senator Tim Scott, who himself just signaled his intention to get into the race. Take a listen at how he struggles in part of her interview to articulate a clear position on the issue of abortion rights.
So every time a state, of course, adopts a decision, states have the ability to have the most conservative bills that they can get passed in their legislature. I support the culture of life, without question.
But is 6 weeks the right mile marker?
Well, the people have decided that their elected leaders have the opportunity to do so. So I say absolutely, as the culture of life is being protected, we should celebrate that. States will have different varying views on that, but yes, if I were president of the United States, I would literally sign the most conservative pro-life legislation that they can get through Congress.
Even if it was 6 weeks?
I'm not going to talk about 6 or 5 or 7 or 10. I'm just saying that whatever the most conservative legislation is that can come through Congress
is what you would sign.
Yes.
It is notable it's a different answer that he gave another network yesterday on abortion, where he talked about being 100% pro-life, but at the same time seemed to be open to a 20-week limit if that was what could get passed through the U.S. Congress. Bottom line, as you can see, Republicans like Senator Scott or Governor DeSantis, they find themselves facing perhaps what is an impossible task of navigating national politics while also navigating Trump's Republican Party. So joining me now, Gary Fineout. He is a Florida man covering Florida politics for Politico, and my NBC News colleague, Ali Vitale, who's been traveling to the early states a lot and sat down with Senator Tim Scott earlier today. Gary, let me start with the optics issue here with Governor DeSantis. The administration has given Fort Lauderdale everything it needs. It's done all the administrative stuff that's needed. But it is pretty notable that he decided not to be a physical presence at all during this crisis down there. And it's not lost on those of us who are very familiar with Florida politics that the bluest county in the state is Broward County. And yet he came in and out of the state. It's been an odd way he's handled the Fort Lauderdale situation. Can you give any insight?
Well, the only insight I can give is that these events that he attended were previously scheduled, and I guess the question would have been, would he have been able to cancel an appearance at Liberty? Would he have been able to cancel an appearance at New Hampshire? Would the narrative have been, oh, what's he doing? Why isn't he here? I mean, I understand what you're saying about the flooding, but yeah, what was more interesting to me was the fact that that they wanted to get the bill signing done last night, and they did, and then he goes to Liberty, and just as a casual aside, you would think, oh, well, he's going to talk about it. Right. That's why they wanted the bill signing. And then he didn't really talk about it. So that was a little bit of a surprise, I would say.
Gary, I am really curious. He has really been a conundrum to me on abortion, because he made a big deal out of lowering the 15-week, then didn't want to have anything, didn't want to talk about it. And you just described what he did in the last 24 hours, which on one hand, it looks like he wanted to get some short-term political benefit, but didn't go. I mean, it appears to me, it looks like he's like, look, I don't want to be the only guy who's got more abortions in his state than a year ago. Hard stop. And at the same time, it's like he doesn't want to be defined by this 6-week ban.
Right. And I think that is what you mentioned is an important thing to note, of course, is that Florida's current law, which is only passed just a year ago, still puts it out of step with other southern states. And as we've seen, the statistics have borne out that a lot of people have been coming in from other states and coming into Florida because it has a 15-week ban. And so you're left with the impression that, Florida was a haven, and as compared to other states run by other conservatives. And so what I have been able to glean, however, in continual conversations with people on the DeSantis team, is that as of right now, I mean, the goal has been to sort of take care of everything that could potentially be a speed bump along the way to a Republican primary. And right now they're focused on trying to get his conservative credentials to where they think they're going to be, as one person told me, like impenetrable.
Is there a single Tallahassee Republican, Gary, that is paying attention to what happened in Kansas, what happened in Wisconsin, what happened in Michigan? I mean, La Crosse, Wisconsin is a Republican area. Green Bay votes Republican now. These are not that different than Pasco County. This is not that different than Jacksonville. This feels like, what happens when a party pushes do they really not expect backlash here?
Yeah, but what you also know, of course, is that the Democrats are not in a very strong position here, but the Republicans have a supermajority. And it was very interesting is that House Speaker Paul Renner, who did delve into this very deeply when he was talking to reporters about it this week, basically, I mean, he called this bill, the 6-week ban, a compromise. He said, well, there are people in my party who want to go to a 0-week ban. And he basically, and then I noticed that both the statement that put out by the governor's office and by people like Speaker Renner, they basically pointed to, well, in California and other states, they want abortion on demand all the way up close to birth. I mean, I know that we could argue about what exactly Democrats have said, but the point is that, so that's how they're trying to position it. But I think it gets to the fact that right now, Republicans in Florida, I don't think they see much of a danger to their position. Yeah, I mean, you got to remember, they've been in charge now for more than 2 decades. Right. They've had some close calls, but in the end, they keep winning.
Right. The only time they've lost is if it's a presidential candidate or Bill Nelson, basically. Barack Obama or Bill Nelson. That's basically been about it. Anyway, Gary Fineout, like I said, a Florida man covering Florida politics for our friends at Politico. Appreciate your insight here, sir. Good to see you. Yeah. Let me move over to Ali Vitale. Ali, it's been interesting, Tim Scott and the abortion issue. In some ways, I feel like Tim Scott and his struggle to articulate his position is him looking at the polls and realizing this isn't a good issue to be nailed down on. Is that the sense you got?
Yeah, look, I think it's the reality between the consistency that he said he's 100% pro-life and the new reality that we see in the polls and in electoral politics overall, that reproductive access is a galvanizing issue for Democrats, and it looks like a pretty losing issue for Republicans. And I'm struck as you're talking to Gary about the Florida of it all and how DeSantis will have to own this 6-week abortion ban. I actually think that every Republican will have to own and answer for what every other Republican does on this issue throughout the 2024 presidential campaign, especially because if they're not willing to articulate the position of, well, my position is 15 weeks, 20 weeks, 6 weeks, if they're not willing to articulate it, then every other governor and state legislature throughout the country gets to put the parameters on that conversation for them. And that becomes very problematic when you have states that want to have a 6-week ban, that want to have ones that are much more restrictive. 20 even fell on really tough ears in Washington right before the midterm elections when Lindsey Graham talked about it. The fact that we're now talking about 6, and Scott is finally coming down with a position in that interview saying, yeah, okay, eventually I guess I could get to 6, even though he doesn't say that he wants 6. I mean, it's allowing the rest of the country, and in this case, Governor DeSantis, to define the terms of the debate for everyone on this issue.
Right now, they're all afraid of looking like there's somebody who has they don't want to look like they have a softer position compared to somebody else. Tell me about your travels with Tim Scott, and tell me about the reception he got. I know he's a well-liked figure. He's a well-respected figure. Did you feel like you got people that were ready to sign on, or you got people that were sort of, window shopping?
It's window shopping season in Iowa, Chuck. I mean, that's where I spent time with him on the road. I think it was the same sense in New Hampshire. Folks are just starting to tune in. I think, nevertheless, though, if I think about his stump speech now, it hasn't really changed that much over the entire time that he's been traveling to these early states over the course of the last few months. And it's not heavy on policy specifics. Instead, it sort of toggles between like a hopeful message about what can happen in America while also demonizing Democrats and saying that they have a blueprint to basically ruin and destroy America. So it really is kind of a heavy contrast between those two polls. But I think that's kind of where the contrast ends, especially when you consider in this soundbite that I'm about to play for you, he has a real hard time contrasting with anyone else in the field. Watch. One of the open questions here is you look at the polls, you look at the fact that in this Republican field, President Trump is sort of the man to be. I mean, why should he not be the nominee of the party again?
Well, this is, again, one of the things I'm hearing a lot on the Faith in America tour is that their concern about the most important issues in their lives is what's driving their decisions. And one of the most important issues in their lives is the economic reality that President Biden seems to have figured out a blueprint for how to ruin America. The American people are looking for leadership that is positive, optimistic, and anchored in conservatism. The bill that I wrote, I am thankful that I wrote the bill. When we talk about the opportunity zones that's brought about $200 billion into the poorest communities, I wrote the bill. So there's a very important part of being the architect of the legislation. The American people continue to have an opportunity to weigh in on what their priorities are. My agenda so far has met their priorities. As long as it continues to do so, they'll have a choice to make. And when it's time to make that choice, I believe they'll choose me.
So, look, he thinks that voters are going to make that choice, Chuck, but I even asked him on foreign policy, those recent comments from former President Trump praising Putin and Xi. He seemed to say that's not how we should be talking about our allies, but didn't criticize the former president for our adversaries, but didn't criticize the former president for talking about our adversaries that way. I don't know that you can make it through a Republican primary sounding exactly like Trump on policy, but not delineating from him in any other way. But I guess we're about to find out, because clearly that's Tim Scott's strategy, at least for now.
Allie, another way to look at it is he running to just be on the ticket?
I think that's something that a lot of people are asking. I mean, certainly
when
sources
you don't
in
take any
the
shots,
entire Republican apparatus.
When you take no shots at anybody you're running against, it sounds like you're hoping you're viewed as Switzerland inside the conservative
movement. Yeah, and I think that he's probably going to do a good job of Switzerland. Yeah, that's right.
No, I think that's what it is. Ali Vitale doing a great job of using an umbrella in a live shot. Well done, my friend. We're going to dig more into all of this on the panel. Plus, after the break, the latest from Indianapolis, where top Republicans, including the former president, are taking the stage at the NRA's biggest event of the year. And guess which presidential candidate got booed at the NRA? It won't surprise you. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back to the NRA's annual convention taking place right now in Indianapolis. Donald Trump is scheduled to speak in a few minutes from now. Most of the announced or potential presidential candidates have also addressed convention goers, either live or, in the case of Ron DeSantis, sending a video message. This year's convention comes amid the backdrop of 2 recent high-profile mass shootings, and actually in the same region as where this is. One was at a school in Nashville, and the other was at a bank in Louisville, neither place very far from Indianapolis. Former Vice President Mike Pence addressed those tragedies earlier today when he spoke.
Ignoring the motivations of the trans activists who killed 3 children and 3 adults at that Christian school in Nashville, and ignoring the mental health challenges of the man who killed 5 people and injured 8 others in Louisville. President Biden and the Democrats have returned to the same tired arguments about gun control and gun confiscation. But we don't need gun control. We need crime control. We don't need lectures about the liberties of law-abiding citizens. We need solutions to protect our kids.
Now, that was not the part where he was booed. He was booed at some parts and called a traitor. That, of course, having to do with his relationship to Donald Trump. This year's convention is hardly the first NRA gathering to take place with a deadly mass shooting event basically hovering over the event. Last year's convention came just days after the Uvalde school shooting, which killed 19 children and 2 teachers, and weeks after a white supremacist killed 10 people in a shooting spree at a Buffalo supermarket. The 2019 NRA convention was taking place as a gunman opened fire inside a Southern California synagogue during Passover. And back in 1999, the NRA convention started 10 days and about 15 miles from the Columbine High School, where 2 students killed 13 people and injured more than 20 others. Joining me now on set is Tia Mitchell, Washington correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Naveen Nayak, Democratic strategist and president and executive director of the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and Stephen Hayes, the editor and CEO of The Dispatch, as well as an NBC News political analyst. Stephen, let me start with you and the idea that Mike Pence, who arguably is ideologically in step with the NRA, with so many major conservative institutions, that just because of his relationship with Donald Trump, he's considered persona non grata, called a traitor.
Yeah, I mean, it's a reflection of where the Republican Party is today. And we've seen this now over the course of several years. Look back to the Republican convention in 2020 and the lack of an actual platform. There's not a policy prescription. If you're a Republican these days, it's your loyalty to Donald Trump. Now, I think we're seeing that change at the sort of grassroots level. You have a hardcore base that supports Donald Trump, but you have a bigger collection, I think a growing collection of people who say enough is enough. That's who I think Mike Pence needs to appeal to, but he's, as you were discussing in your earlier segment, they're caught between a rock and a hard place because they don't want to alienate the Trump loyalists, but they want to appeal to people who are sick of Trump.
Yeah, Tia, Mike Pence strikes me as he's the Bruce Willis candidate in Sixth Sense. And this candidacy, he thinks this candidacy is alive. I don't know if he's going to get a look. I don't know if they're going to give him this look.
Right. To Stephen's point, there is a segment of the Republican Party that's wanting to move on from Trump, but we don't know if that's enough to build a majority coalition that you need to win primaries and win a nomination. And that's where Pence and all the others that are looking to challenge Trump are finding themselves challenged, because where is your lane to really go up against Trump, especially with DeSantis hanging in the wind? Well,
it's funny, Naveen. Tim Scott, I've called the Senate Republican nominee. Right. Because every Senate Republican leader, when I ask them I wish it was Tim Scott. Yeah. And they talk about it. And they're the ones that have encouraged him in there. And I asked this person who's been a big encourager, I said, why for Scott? I said, well, he can unify the party. I said, does the party want to be unified? Yeah. And he said, I don't know. And he admitted that. He's like, that's the problem. If it does, Scott can win. Without it, maybe not.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the problem the party faces right now, which is how do they unify without Trump? How do they unify with Trump? In both cases, they are really fractured, and no one's really running the experiment. And, Tim Scott is not, in these first few days, of trying to see if there's a non-MAGA wing that actually wants to be the alternative. They're all trying to basically appeal to MAGA without,
What do you... Trump. Yeah.
The question is, unify around what? Yeah. I believe Tim Scott could be a unifying figure for the Republican Party of 2012 or 2014. Unify around what? I mean, as I just said, they didn't even have a platform in 2020. You talk to Republicans today, you've got a cohort of Republicans who would be comfortable with a Mitt Romney candidacy or somebody like that. And then you've got this base, this Trumpy base. Republicans can't win a general election without the people who are skeptical of Trump. We've seen that, I think, pretty clearly. But it's hard to win a Republican nomination unless you win the hardcore Trump voters.
It is. It's this conundrum that they have here. And Tia, if you were the Biden White House, on one hand, you're ecstatic about all this. But his numbers never improve. And things don't seem to look rosier other than, it's almost like you look over here, you're like, ooh, that car's a mess. And then you look over here, you're like, I can't even drive that car. I mean, that's what you end up looking like.
Yeah, I mean, and to me, that looks like that's the Biden strategy right now. It's like, let the Republicans continue to make each other look crazy, or, you know, make themselves create challenges for themselves. And Biden will just lay low, or not even lay low. Biden will focus on what he's done and trying to sell himself as like the president for the people. And hopefully that'll work out when it comes a one-on-one competition. Now, that's leaving a lot to be, a lot up to what could happen over the next year.
But we heard this argument in 2016, Naveen. Oh, just wait till it's Trump and one other. You know,
in the primary.
Right, the primary. And that's what it'll come. Because Trump doesn't have 50% until he got 50%. Right?
I mean, that to me is just really the challenge. And no one wants to take him on. And I think that's the experiment that someone has to be willing to run. And it, you know, Asa Hutchinson maybe, but it has to be someone with some stature. And Ron DeSantis keeps doing this.
Well, what do you make of
ways.
DeSantis, Steve? He feels like he's in. I feel like we're watching him shrink before our eyes. Yeah. The guy in January looked like this potential huge stalking horse, and you're like, oh. And now, you know, he strikes me as somebody who's constantly sailing, but literally tacking. Oh, I got to do this. I got to do this. Right. And it's almost he's hearing everybody's criticism and responding to everybody's criticism.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, he's obviously had a rough patch here. It seems to me that his campaign and maybe the candidate himself is having a hard time deciding whether he wants to try to split the Trump coalition, the MAGA voters that I think all agree are likely to be needed to win the Republican nomination, or if he can build a coalition that doesn't require winning them. As of right now, he certainly seems to be courting the Trump base. I mean, if you look at his outreach to the so-called national conservative movement and the kinds of policies that he's advocated, they're a departure from policies that he's believed in and argued for in years past, but they're popular with that Republican base right now.
Donald Trump's going on the air to you with an attack ad, hitting DeSantis on social. He is really trying to make this. He wants everybody to think of DeSantis inside the party as the guy who wants to cut Social Security. And DeSantis is not doing anything to inoculate himself on this. I think he's not paying enough attention to this problem.
I found the ad so interesting because, of
course,
it's about policy, but it's also about trolling DeSantis.
By the way, I had to Google the pudding story. I hadn't.
Oh, you hadn't heard about the pudding.
But now you know about it, right? I mean,
no, I did have to Google it because some of us have decided to try to cover politics without going on social media. By the way, my life's been terrific.
That's better.
And but that's the thing. It's not just about dinging him on policy. It's about, trying to humiliate him, trying to marginalize him, which we know Trump does really well to his opponents. But your point is made that DeSantis is not hitting back, partially because he hasn't seemed to figure out what he wants to do about Trump and the big Trump base of the party.
Before we go, I want to play a clip. I want to get into this Dianne Feinstein business, Naveen. We play a clip of what Senator Klobuchar had to say about about how Democrats are going about trying to push her out of office. Take a listen.
Do you have confidence that she can continue to fulfill her constitutional duties as the senator from California?
Well, I'm hopeful that she can. Again, I want to see what happens in the next month or so. You give her that time to be able to come back. But if she can't come back month after month after month with this close Senate, that's not just going to hurt California. It's going to be an issue for the country.
I mean, I understand that when it comes to judicial nominations, the ends justifies the means in our politics these days. We can discuss who started it. I don't want to get into that debate. But this just seems like a bad look of just trying to push an old lady out of office.
I mean, I think that there's been a handful of people who have kind of gone there.
You think it's gone too far?
I mean, I do think this is a woman who's given her life to public service.
Almost literally gave her life for public service.
Yes.
I mean, bullets went by her, okay?
Absolutely. And so I do think most people have landed in the place of, let's give her time to see if she's healthy and can come back. I think she would be the first person to say that if her recovery does take months, it really doesn't make sense. And listen, the courts and the importance of the courts, it's not just, I mean, the significance now when we talk about abortion, we talk about gerrymandering, voting rights.
I
think
understand.
People sort of appreciate.
I get it.
Yeah.
It is like, I had Brad Todd on here yesterday, Steve. I said, geez, you know, if this were the Senate Finance Committee and somebody had to step aside and replace, it would be no problem. And I'm like, so Republicans, knowing that they have Chuck Grassley, who could also become an issue for them. And he says, nope, not when it comes to judges. There's no cooperation between the two parties.
Yeah, it's very different. I mean, it is the issue that's polarized Washington long before this moment.
Oh, it's destroying this. I think it's destroying our politics, or this obsession.
But I would disagree with you on Dianne Feinstein. Her problems have been an open secret, not for weeks, not for months, for years. Reporters around Capitol Hill tiptoe around asking questions of her that they ask every single other member of Congress because they're worried about making her look bad. From a human level, I mean, this is true of conservative reporters and liberal reporters.
This was done to Thad Cochran. This was done to Strom Thurmond. This was done. The point is, it does seem like she's being treated slightly differently than some of these old guys.
I mean, I thought not Thad Cochran. I mean, certainly not near the end of his time. And there were questions about that.
Oh, I know, but nobody pushed him out of office.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should have it's better if we can have an open and honest debate about people who aren't capable of serving in office.
I don't think there are a lot of good actors here, Tia. I think the senator's family's not looking out for her. I think the senator's staff is not looking out for her. I think everybody's thinking about politics. Nobody's thinking about the person.
Right. And I think about the person, yes, and if she's not doing well, she probably shouldn't be serving in Congress.
Where's her family? That's what I'm wondering. Where's her family to sort of help in this situation?
Also, we have to think this is a nation of several 100 million people. And there are only 100 senators and 435 members of the House, and you want them all to be healthy and cognizant and working hard for the American people. And if you're one of 100 and you can't do your job, and I'm not going to say about age, but for whatever reason, in the long term, that's not good for the country.
No, it's all true. It does seem like it's selective, depending on the person. All right, Tia, Naveen, and Stephen, thank you. Up next, the suspected leaker behind that major breach of U.S. intelligence just appeared in court for the first time. The latest on the story and the criminal charges that the 21-year-old National Guardsman faces. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. 21-year-old Jack Teixeira, the Air National Guardsman accused of sharing top-secret government documents, made his first court appearance in Boston today. Teixeira is being charged with possessing classified documents pertaining to national security and possessing national defense materials. Those charges carry a maximum sentence of 10 years in jail. According to the unsealed affidavit, Teixeira has held a top-secret security clearance as well as access to sensitive compartmental information since 2021. On April 6, when reporting about the leak first became public, the FBI says Teixeira searched a classified database for the word leak. The FBI believes he was looking into the status of the intel community's investigation. The affidavit also says the FBI contacted a member of the online chat group on or around April 10th. That was Monday, ahead of Teixeira's arrest yesterday in North Dayton, Massachusetts. So joining me now is Shane Harris, intelligence and national security reporter at The Washington Post. He spoke to one of the members of this online chat room, looks like before the FBI got to him, where these classified documents were shared. Shane, it's good to see you. Congrats again on this scoop. But let me start with this. Do we know if all the documents that he could have released have been released? Is the leak over, or could more stuff pop up?
I think it's safe to say that no. The documents that he had in his possession or that he shared with the group have not all been made public. I would say probably only a fraction of them really have. I think, we have, at the Post, I have seen more than 300 documents, and I think there's around 50 or 60 maybe that have been out there that have been reported on. So there's a lot more that's out there, Chuck.
And it just buried in the internet or in this chat group, or what? We don't know.
I think it's safe to say they're no longer on the internet, but I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. As for Teixeira, essentially, he had all this access and clearances because of his IT work. Is the military at all rethinking how they do this?
I think they're going to be asking a lot of those questions. And in fact, President Biden said today that he's ordered the intelligence community in the military to start looking at tighter restrictions. But I mean, honestly, that's kind of what you would expect him to say. And the fact is there have been other breaches like this in the past decade. I think of Chelsea Manning, I think of Edward Snowden, where you have people, including low-level people like Teixeira, who have these very high-level security clearances and manage to get information that they have authorized access to, but are certainly certainly not authorized to share, and they essentially walk it out of the building and make it public. So we've seen this before, and each time officials have assured the public they're putting guardrails in place to prevent this kind of, as they call, insider threat, and consistently they have proved to be, imperfect.
Do we get a sense that Teixeira went, aggressively looking for this material to find, or was it stuff he sort of stumbled upon as he was doing his job?
I think it's probably more of the latter. I mean, it seems like there's a consistency to what he was sharing in that they were daily updates and kind of intelligence reports over the course of a number of months. Now, we believe he would have had access to them because he had access to a particular computer system that will get you to those documents. It's also not clear, though, were some of these things maybe printed out in the office and lying around? Was there something in the trash that he retrieved? So we don't know entirely how he did it, but the basic fact is that based on his clearances and access that he had to an internal Defense Department network, he could have conceivably gotten access to what we're looking at right now.
And I guess that's what and I look at his background. I mean, did all of his IT training come from within the military?
It seems that way. I mean, we don't know a lot about what happened in his life before he got to the military. He had this specialty that is basically like a tech support person. And it seems that, he got to the Air Force, maybe they trained him in this. But what we do know is that he had a longer history of being very interested in online gaming. He was clearly technologically very fluent. I mean, administering Discord servers, communicating with people online. So he understood technology, I think it's probably safe to say, before he joined the military, where working with technology was his job. But there he's just working on, computer networks and systems. It's fairly basic, I think, compared to the stuff he was doing in his real life.
Do we have an idea of, there seemed to be some anti-Semitic and racist tropes that he was dabbling in. Do we have a sense of, not necessarily political motivation, but something else here?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I talked to a couple members of the community who said, yes, they did share and post racist memes and jokes and anti-Semitic commentary. But one of them said, look, it really wasn't about that. This wasn't a political group. And he was really adamant that Teixeira was only sharing this classified information with these, largely teenage boys in the group as a way of impressing them, what a big shot he was, that he had access to all of these secrets, and that he never intended for it to go out more widely. This person also, though, said Teixeira knew what he was doing was illegal. Those were the words that he used, and said he is absolutely not a whistleblower. He was doing this to impress his friends.
Well, that was always one of the theories of motivation. If it's not money, if it's not ideology, sometimes it's simply ego.
Yeah.
Shane Harris at the Washington Post. Shane, thank you. Happy
Thanks,
weekend
Chuck.
to you. We'll be back Monday with more Meet the Press Now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.